everyone. How are you doing this evening? Good. Thank you for coming. It's actually very interesting that we have a small group, but we are recording tonight's lecture because I received so many phone calls from people who said, thank you for covering this topic, that we're really interested in this topic, but we can't come because we have chemical sensitivities. I mean, I probably had 8 or 9, 10 in that range of people who were really interested, and one woman sent me some brochures that she wanted me to place up there, so those are from someone named Susie, and there were a shocking number of people who were really excited about this topic and saying that they couldn't come to hear about the topic because of their aversion to fragrance chemicals. So we have invited up a group of researchers and graduate students from the University of California at Davis. We have our monthly lecture each month, and the next lecture that's coming up is February 23rd on transportation sustainability. It is with Dan Sperling and Tom Turrentine with the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, and they are going to be talking about a lecture on 2 billion cars driving towards sustainability. And there's actually a book on the topic, and it should be another excellent topic to present. And what else do I want to share? We have a Project WET workshop coming up on February 9th. It's going to be here, and February 16th will be in South Shore, and that's water education for teachers. So if anyone's interested in learning about presenting water topics to kids all the way pre-K through college, it's a really fun hands-on workshop. And then on March 22nd, we're having a climate change lecture with Dr. Howie Spiro, who's an internationally known climate scientist who's going to be talking about our changing oceans and how they're using ocean algae to learn about climate change. So I am going to stop my introductions and welcome up our group from UC Davis, and they can introduce themselves. They'll do a better job than I will. So please give them a round of applause and welcome.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hello.
How are you all doing tonight? So before we begin, I want to just take a brief moment to talk about our group. And I know there's a lot of acronyms like IGERT and REACH, and that's a little bit distinct. So IGERT essentially is a nationally known program funded by the National Science Foundation. And they're across the nation, and basically they're programs to get graduate students trained to creating these projects that are multidisciplinary. And so IGER stands for Integrative Graduate Research Education and Traineeship. And the IGERT at UC Davis that we're a part of is called REACH, and that stands for Responding to Rapid Environmental Change. And just as the name implies, it essentially focuses on understanding the responses to rapid environmental change. And today you'll have a unique opportunity to get an example of what types of projects come out of this particular IGERT. So before we begin, I want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Carmen Cortez. I'm in the graduate group in ecology. My focus is in human ecology. Jennifer Balatowski could not join us. She's also one of our team members. She's a plant scientist. And our advisors, Rick Grossberg and Carol Hom. They're both in the Department of Evolution and Ecology. And I'll let the rest of my colleagues present themselves.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Meredith Niles. I'm also in the graduate group in ecology at UC Davis. I'm in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. So I'm sort of the resident policy person on this team, and I study agriculture and climate change policy.
My name is Susan Chen, and I'm in the Agricultural Resource Economics program at UC Davis, and just focusing on resource and natural resource economics.
I'm Jessica Abbott. I'm in the Population Biology graduate group. My focus is on marine ecology, and I'm in the Department of Evolution and Ecology. Okay, so before we jump into our research and what we did, I want to just walk you through what we're talking about today. And as you'll see, we focused on sort of the human component of fragrance chemicals in personal care products and how people make decisions about when to use them and how to use them. But we also wanted to frame this in a broader context as an emerging environmental issue. And so First, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what an emerging environmental issue is and how fragrance chemicals fit into that. And then we'll move into our own research and look more at this human behavior component, talk about the research that we did, which was a national survey, go into the results, and then we'll conclude bringing everything together and talking about some resources for you to use to be able to make informed decisions about using personal care products. So what is an emerging issue? Well, the United Nations describes an emerging issue as an issue, positive or negative, which is not yet generally recognized, but which may have significant impact on human and or ecosystem health in the 21st century. And so an interesting part of this is the not yet generally recognized. So if these are really important issues and they could potentially have these high impacts, how are they not known about in the public? Well, some of these are surprises. Some emerging issues like the ozone hole were things that people didn't predict that were going to happen. Other things are accidents like oil spills where no one really knows that it's going to happen, and even though you try to prevent it, it becomes an issue that needs to be dealt with. Yet many emerging issues are existing issues that we know something about, like climate change, desertification, or plastics in the oceans. Yet these are things that we may not know exactly what the consequences are yet, or have really good solutions for how to fix them. And so we know that there are these existing emerging issues, but so what's the kind of definition of an emerging issue? Well, here are 3 characteristics that we think are pretty common across emerging issues. The first is that there are changes in human activity that feed back to affect people and the environment. The second is that there's new evidence or theory that suggests that there are these dramatic environmental changes, but maybe there's not, maybe most people don't know about it yet, or there's not necessarily consensus about what's causing it or how to deal with it. And a third characteristic that's common across emerging issues is there's usually a lack of adequate policy instruments for addressing this worsening issue. And so there are some challenges that surround addressing emerging issues. Often they're controversial. There can be disagreement among scientists, policymakers, or both about what the actual impacts of these issues are going to be and how to effectively deal with them. There's also a lot of uncertainty. So it requires decision making without necessarily knowing what the future holds. And as such, it's kind of risky because you have to make sacrifices today to potentially prevent future harm. And so that's sort of an overview of what general emerging issues are. And now I'm going to walk you through why we think that fragrance chemicals and personal care products are a good example of an emerging issue. So going back to that first point, that there are changes in human activity that feed back to affect people in the environment. So the change here really is the increase in use of fragrances. So it used to be more that fragrances were for special occasions, or they're mostly in perfumes or colognes. But now they're in so many of our products. They're in our soaps and shampoos, our cleaning products, all sorts of things. And it's a huge industry. The flavor and fragrance industry sales from 2010 were about $22 billion. And this is nearly double the sales in 2000, which were about $13 billion. So you can see there's a dramatic increase in the use of these fragrance and flavor chemicals. And if you look at the market for fragrances in 2006, you can see that the majority of the market is for cosmetics, toiletries, soaps, detergents, and household cleaners. And really, only a fairly small fraction, only about 20%, goes into these fine fragrances or perfumes and colognes. And so so there's a clear increase in the use of fragrances. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's plenty of public media that pick up on this too.
I spend a lot of my time in the morning grooming. I try to be quick about it, but the guy in the mirror keeps coming on. That's why I'm giving a tip of my hat to the new disposable razor for men, the Schick Extreme 3 Fit Style Refresh. This ain't your daddy's Schick Extreme 3 Fit Style. This one has added the word refresh. Because unlike every men's razor that has ever come before it, this one has a scented handle that blends notes of spearmint, citrus, and rosemary and evokes having just showered. Remind me, you can smell something that smells like it just showered right after you've just showered. And I say it's about damn time. I cannot tell you how many mornings I stood in my bathroom smelling my soap, a shampoo, conditioner, body wash, body spray, facial lotion, shaving cream, aftershave, and hand lotion, and said, something's missing. And the people over at Schick agree with me, telling the New York Times the razor is probably the only thing left in the shower that's not scented. Bravo, gentlemen. Now I can throw away my previous solution, shaving with a box cutter duct taped to a Glade plug-in. Right up there. Next up.
So you can see that there is this change in human behavior. As more and more fragrances are being added to products. So we see this change in human activity. And so the next part of this is that this feeds back to affect people and the environment. And so we know that there are some demonstrated health impacts of fragrances and also evidence of potential negative impacts to the environment. So the fragrance industry uses nearly 3,000 ingredients in its products. Most of these are synthetic compounds, they're not natural compounds, and 900 have been identified as being toxic. And a single fragrance in any of these products is not just one ingredient. It can sometimes be hundreds of different chemicals. And studies have found that these chemicals are often emitted into the air and become vapors that we can breathe in. And some of these of which are toxic and or carcinogenic. And one study found that green, organic, or natural products contain about the same number of toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, fragrance chemicals, as do conventional products. So it's not necessarily true that organic or natural will be healthier in terms of the fragrance. And we also know that many people, as was discussed earlier, have allergies to fragrance. And this can cause things like headaches and dizziness and nausea and all these different side effects. And the survey showed that about 30% of the general public have experienced some sort of irritation due to fragrance chemicals. And this percentage can be much higher in people that have asthma or chemical sensitivities. And one of the most common allergic reactions are skin irritation or rashes, with 20% of the general public experiencing this form of irritation. So we see that these products are affecting people and their health. We also have some evidence that they have potential harm to the environment. There's been studies of these two very common fragrance chemicals, limonene and musks, that are in all sorts of fragrances. And they're the ones where the most work has been done to study their toxicity. And they found that these can have harmful effects to many animals, including insects, fish, cats, rats. And limonene is also known to be used as an herbicide, so it kills and slows the growth of many plants. There's also been studies that find increased risk of breast cancer due to musk chemicals, and that musks can also cause liver damage in rats. Now, I will note that in many of these cases, they're using concentrations of chemicals that are much higher than the ones that are typically found in the environment. But these chemicals also can attach to people and be ingested and sometimes rise to higher concentrations within plants or animals or people. And so there could be the potential to see higher concentrations in animals than necessarily in, say, water samples. So we could see potentially some of these toxic effects. And so moving on, the second characteristic of emerging issues is that there's new evidence that suggests some environmental change, but it may not be widely known or accepted. And so one of the new areas of research that's really exciting right now is thinking about what the fates or the persistence of these chemicals are in the environment. And so one of the things that people often think about with toxicity is if something is really persistent in the environment, if it lasts a really long time, then there's more exposure potential and more chance that animals or people will be exposed to it. However, the unique thing about fragrances, or an interesting thing about fragrance chemicals, is that because they're in so many products, they're being continually input into the environment. We use these products on a daily basis, and so even though some of them may not be very persistent in the environment, because they're constantly introduced, animals and people may still have a high exposure potential. And we do indeed see that these chemicals are really common and ubiquitous in the environment. They're found in waterways and rivers, lakes, and estuaries. They've been found in air and homes and public places, and even to be emitted from baby bathwater in some studies. And as I said, we do know that they can accumulate in animals and people. They've been found in the tissues of many different types of animals, and also in the fat tissue in people and in breast milk. So we know that they're all over the place. They're in people, they're in the environment. But there's also new research that is showing that not only do we have to worry about these main primary chemicals that are put into these products, but what happens to them once they enter the environment, because they can break down into other chemicals or interact with chemicals already in the environment to have more potentially harmful effects. So if you have a parent compound or the original compound, once it enters the environment, it may break down, and these secondary compounds can actually, in some cases, be more toxic than the parent compound, and this is true in some musk chemicals. You might also have two different chemicals, each with their own toxicity level, that when interacting in the environment will have a synergistic effect that makes their toxicity even greater than either of the two. And so the third aspect of fragrance or of emerging issues that was mentioned earlier is this lack of adequate policy instruments to address a worsening issue. And there really is a lack of regulation ensuring the safety of fragrance products and making sure that there's information for people to make informed decisions. So in the U.S., the FDA monitors personal care products, and they require the labeling of all ingredients, except they can use the word fragrance to and not list all of the ingredients in that fragrance. So you can see on this label from the U.S. that it just says fragrance or parfum. And so you don't know how many different chemicals might be within that fragrance, and it's not required to have them listed on that label. And if we contrast this with the European Union, their fragrances are regulated under the Cosmetics Directive, and they ban the use of some musk chemicals. And they also have this new amendment that added 26 new ingredients known to be allergens that are restricted in use, and if they are used, they're required to be labeled. And so this is just showing a label from London, and you can see limonene, which is one of those chemicals I discussed earlier, clearly labeled on the product. And so fragrance chemicals sort of meet all of the criteria for being an emerging issue. But we wanted, when we were looking at this issue, we thought, where can we contribute? How can we what can we contribute to our understanding of this issue? And we're not ecotoxicologists, and there's plenty of really talented people already working on that. But one of the things that we thought was really interesting was the universality of this issue, that people every day use these products. And so it's individuals that are making decisions about which products to use, as well as some of the regulatory and policy aspects that are really driving the input of these fragrance chemicals into the environment. And so that's what we chose to focus on, was this human component. And we chose to look at three particular questions, which are: what factors predict consumer behavior when purchasing fragrance personal care products? How do people obtain and perceive information about these products? And what factors predict support for policy instruments relating to these products? And so you're going to hear in just a minute from Susan about the research that we actually did surveying people about these questions. But before we do that, Carmen's going to tell you a little bit about the survey that we gave to you before you came in here.
So before you arrived and came into the room, we asked you how many products that you use today. And by the slide, we're not implying that not at all you smell each other, but some of you ended up giving us a whole list, maybe 14 or 10 products The shortest list was 2, which I don't know if I believe completely because it says just shampoo and conditioner. But this is just an indication of the different products that we use on our daily basis. And Susan will talk more about the methodology, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about what these products mean and consumer information about how to look at these products differently.
So, as you guys, we had the range between 2 and 14, and maybe some of your morning procedures might look like this, or maybe even this. But when we did our we did a survey in order to go and answer the research questions that we had posed in Jessica's section. And what we wanted to do was to ask people about their personal care product use and whether or not they were scented, natural and organic, or unscented. And in the beginning of the survey, we set out a list of products. And looking at this list, I don't know if anybody can think of like, oh yeah, I missed that, or oh yeah, I should have put that down. And maybe I don't use that every day, but I use that once in a while. Because when we were making the survey, we recognized ourselves that we use these products so much that oftentimes we don't even think about it anymore. We conducted the survey, the survey had 3 parts. The first part was to ask people about their personal care product use and purchasing. And I'm going to go into detail in each of these 3 sections. The second section was about their perceptions of fragrance and fragrance personal care products. And the third section was about perceptions of the environment, health, science, and industry. We conducted the survey last year, May 2011, and we conducted the survey using SurveyMonkey, and our sample was selected. It was a national survey by SSI, the Survey Sampling International. We had about 1,500 responses, and because of certain criteria, like they had to be over 18 or they had to answer yes to certain questions, we had a total of 1,400 that we could use. In our first section, we talked about personal care products and purchasing, and we wanted to find out what people use. They use scented, unscented, organic, and we kind of used the scented and organic products as a proxy for, we had a hypothesis that those people would be more environmentally friendly and therefore buy those products. So we asked questions such as, do your personal care products contain an added scent or fragrance? And we gave them a couple of options, like all of them do, some of them do, most of them do, or I don't know. We also asked them, why do you use a fragrance personal care product instead of an unfragranced one? And these were options. We had like different branching questions depending on like the first question they had. And select all that apply. So it's the only product conveniently available to me. I like the scent or fragrance. I want to smell good to other people. I want to smell good for myself, or I use this product for another reason. And in this section, we also asked them how often they use a scented, unscented, or organic product. And Meredith later on is going to talk about some of the results that we got from these surveys, so she's going to come back to these questions and give you the results that we got. The second section that we had was about perceptions of fragrance personal care products. So we asked them, like on a scale of 1 to 6, how risky they thought these products were to the environment or to people. We wanted to contrast sort of health and safety to themselves and the environment versus the environment. And we also asked them how certain they were, because our survey was also about information and where people were getting information, how readily available information were to them. And then on question 25 was to what extent are fragrance personal care products safe or harmful, and we gave them a scale to choose from. We also asked them about their personal experience. So, sorry, I didn't notice that. But we asked them about personal care products. Does the government require manufacturers to list all of the chemicals? And as Jess pointed out, no, in the U.S. that's not required. So if anybody ever asks you this on a survey, you know the correct answer. And we also asked them where do they get information about, or do they seek information about fragrance personal care products? And also in another follow-up question, we asked them where they sought information. We also in this section, I think, asked about whether or not they had known anybody who had experienced problems with fragrance personal care products. And as Heather had mentioned very early on, a lot of people had called in saying they had fragrance sensitivities. The last section was about perception of environment, health, science, and industry. And in this section, we wanted to get an idea of how people felt about environmental problems. So we had a list of environmental problems: endangered species or biodiversity, deforestation, and air pollution. We then contrasted these set of questions to another question about just national problems in general, maybe about social security, safety and defense, and we also included an environmental problems in general, just to see how people actually felt about environmental problems versus social problems. We also asked them about whether or not they thought, what they thought about government regulation. And so in this case, we asked them questions such as the government should limit the manufacture of fragrance personal care products that demonstrated negative environmental impacts, and asked them whether or not they agreed or disagreed. So those were some of the questions that we had in our survey, and we had 3 sections in our survey to get an idea of how people felt. In regards to the demographics, we felt that we had a pretty good sampling. Surveys with SSI, we got responses from all over the country, including Alaska and Hawaii. And when it came to race and ethnicity, we thought that we had a pretty good sampling, and it followed the national demographics as well. In income distribution, we had fewer in the 35 to 50,000 income range, but otherwise we thought that it was a pretty good sample. And in the age distribution, we also had more in the 45 and 64 age range. And I think, with any online survey, you probably have problems with online access, who has access to computers. But we thought that this was a good sampling for our survey. And in education, again, we had more in the college degree and less in those with high school, but it was still pretty similar distribution. So now I'm going to turn it over to Meredith, and she's going to talk about our results.
Thank you. So now the moment you've all been waiting for, learning about our results. As was mentioned a couple of times, we did this survey because we really wanted to understand why people are using certain products, what's driving that, how are they using them when they think about the environment and their own public health and things like that. And as Susan mentioned, we were hypothesizing that people who are using organic, natural, and unscented products might be more environmentally friendly. And so we were kind of using that behavior as a proxy for a positive environmental behavior. But as was mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about later, that's not necessarily the case with regards to fragrance chemicals. So the first question that Susan mentioned that we asked about was whether or not your personal care product actually contains a scent. And we found the majority of people are actually using products that contain a scent, as we all are as well. Only about 6% of people said that none of their products contained a scent. And so the majority of people said that, in fact, they did. And when we asked people why are they using a scented product, well, not surprisingly, they like the scent, but also they're using it because they want to smell good for themselves or smell good for other people. We also wanted to understand about natural and unscented product use. And so here you can see the purple bars are people using organic products, and the green is unscented product use. And what we found is that the majority of people rarely use either organic or unscented products. Some people never use them, and to a much smaller extent, always and frequently. In general, people were using unscented products more frequently than organic products. And when we asked people about why they're using organic or unscented products, one thing that people said was that they wanted to use a natural product, so they wanted to use something that didn't have chemicals, which is the second part. They wanted to avoid chemicals. So there was this perception that choosing organic, natural, or unscented would be a chemical-free option or have less chemicals. We also found that people really wanted to use these products because they thought that they were better for the environment or better for their own health. And we did have one really interesting conclusion. We allowed people to give us other reasons that they might use some of these products. We were certainly anticipating that, most people using unscented and organic products would be very environmentally friendly and pro-environment. And then we found this surprising result. Someone said, my preference is that fragrance personal care products do not have a heavy or overpowering scent. I prefer something very light that will not overcome my cologne or perfume. So we actually found that there were people using unscented products because they didn't want their scents to conflict, and they were wearing maybe a really nice perfume and they didn't want all their body lotion and shampoo to conflict with their scent. So this was a surprising result for us, something that we certainly weren't expecting. We were really interested to understand what were the most important considerations people chose or used when choosing their products. And you can see here the major concern for people is cost. Cost is almost 80% of people saying that's a major concern for them. And this was select all that apply, but still the majority of people say cost is a major issue. And this is followed by also the effectiveness of the product. But you can also see the third reason up there is the scent itself. And so a lot of people are choosing products because they like the scent and they like the way that it smells. And then farther down on the list, around 10% of people were telling us they were choosing a product for environmental reasons or for natural or organic products or for the lack of scent in the product. So overwhelmingly we see that if people are choosing a product for a scent, it's the presence of the scent, not the absence of the scent. We were wondering with regards to how these decisions influence what types of products that they used. So we found that if someone cared about the cost, they were less likely to use organic products. Some people mentioned that was because of they were frequently more expensive. We also found if you cared about the scent presence, not surprisingly, you were more likely to buy scented products and less likely to buy unscented or organic products. If you were looking for ingredients for health reasons, people were more likely to buy organic and to a lesser extent unscented, which is a little bit different than what we were expecting. We were anticipating that unscented products might be more a health issue and organic might be more of an environmental issue. But instead we found that organic was actually also a health issue. And finally, if you were buying ingredients for environmental reasons, they were more likely to buy organic. We also were interested in how demographics might influence people's purchasing habits, and so we found that people who might be using organic products were more likely to be younger, to be African American or Asian Pacific Islander, to be from a higher income bracket, and also to have a higher formal level of education. People who were more likely to use unscented products were older, were male, had fewer children, and also had a higher formal level of education. And finally, the most likely people to use scented products were also younger, had more children, and were from a lower level of formal education. So back to that interesting question about the environment, we really were curious about how our topic, which we think is an emerging issue, fit in with people's perceptions of other environmental issues. So here you can say we asked people to rank on a concern scale from 1, which is not concerned, down here at the bottom, all the way up to extremely concerned for 6. The most concerning issue for people is air pollution, followed by depletion of non-renewable resources and pesticides. And then you can see our survey topic all the way down at the bottom, which is fragrance, chemicals, and personal care products. So this a little bit proved our hypothesis in the sense that this could be an issue that people are not widely aware of in terms of an emerging issue. And that might have looked pretty good. People seem to be pretty concerned about the environment, but when we compared that to people's perceptions about other issues, we found the environment was the least concerning to people, while not surprisingly in our current economic status, the economy and jobs were the most concerning. So we found that about 1 out of every 4 people told us that they do actually seek information on fragrance personal care products. And when we asked them why they were looking for information, the number 1 reason was that they were doing this to look for ingredients for health reasons. Possibly they had allergies or something like that. To a lesser extent, people were looking at ingredients in their products for environmental reasons, and to a lesser extent to know about emerging environmental issues. We also asked about whether people read their ingredient labels, and we found that the majority of people, about 75% of people, do either always or sometimes read their ingredient labels. And again, a common theme, we found that people are majority reading their labels to avoid ingredients for health reasons, and then to a lesser extent to avoid ingredients for the environment. Now back to that infamous question we've brought up several times. Does the government require all ingredients to be listed? When we asked this question, we got a lot of uncertainty. 55% of people said they don't know. Interestingly, only about 22% of people said yes, which is completely wrong, and only 23% of people got the question right. So we found that about 3/4 of people either didn't know that the government doesn't require this labeling, or they incorrectly thought that the government was requiring it and maybe protecting them more than they actually are. One of the things that was really interesting as a result of that, though, was the support for government regulation that we found. We asked people whether they would support government regulation for labeling of personal care products and fragrance chemicals, or whether they would support the government limiting manufacture of products that have health and environmental impacts. And here you can see a scale that ranges from purple, which is strongly disagree, up to orange, which is don't know, and blues are strongly agree. And the majority here is blue. And so the majority of people actually support government regulation to limit the manufacture of these products for environmental and human health impacts that are demonstrated. And they also, majority support labeling of all ingredients similar to an EU type of policy. This is a statistic that's come up a couple times tonight. We found that 22% of people in our survey either personally had experienced health issues from fragrance personal care products or knew someone that had. This is somewhat similar to other surveys that have found about 20 to 30% of people in the national demographic experience these issues. And we also found that people who had this personal experience with fragrances were more likely to seek information, they were more likely to read their ingredient labels, and they were also more likely to purchase unscented and organic products. And with regards to the risk that people perceive about these, this was something that we were a little bit surprised about, but you can see here the risk range goes from blue, which is no risk, up to orange, which is extreme risk. And we found that most people don't really think there is a big risk from these. This is risk to people and risk to the environment. And in general, they think that they're slightly less risky to people and a little bit more risky to the environment. And we found that if you thought that fragrance products were risky for the environment, that you were almost twice as likely to buy organic over unscented products. If you thought they were risky to people, you were about 25% more likely to buy organic over unscented products. But again, we found that organic purchasing was driving both this health and environmental perspective. And finally, if you thought that they were potentially risky to both, that you were much less likely to buy scented products. So 3 of our major themes, just to conclude our results, and then we're going to have Carmen do a few resources for you guys and some concluding remarks. We found that in general, people were more concerned about health issues than environmental issues. This is not necessarily surprising. Obviously, people care a lot about their own personal health, but we think there's obviously a direct connection between human health and environmental health. We also found that people using organic and unscented products were generally more concerned about the health and environment, and they also were more supportive of government policy. And finally, we found that people who had access to information, who were seeking information more, who were reading their ingredient labels, were more likely to make this pro-environmental behavior decision, which was using organic and unscented products. But as we've already mentioned, current government regulations really prevent us often from knowing all of the ingredients in our products. So we're going to finish it off with Carmen with a few resources for you.
So this last year in August, the head of the California EPA, Matt Rodriguez, was asked what are going to be the top priorities for California to address in terms of the ecosystems or the natural environment. And one of the top things that he mentioned was what he referred to as, taking a look a little bit deeper into green chemistry, or some of the pollutants that we as people use in our everyday lives. So for us, one of the things that we have to recognize is that we're just a smaller piece in a larger ecosystem. And that really, in order for us to be able to look back and address this problem at its root, that we also need to take some steps to understanding some of the behaviors that us as human beings have in contributing to this problem as well. And so some of the major things that were already discussed before, and just to reiterate them, is that an interesting part is that people are aware that fragrance chemicals are in their personal care products. we saw that in our results, that either people are specifically looking for these chemicals, fragrance chemicals, for smelling good, for environmental reasons, so they're specifically avoiding these fragrance chemicals for that reason, and also for health reasons. Additionally, we see that a subset of the respondents in our survey tend to have pro-environmental types of behaviors based on the fact that they're choosing some products that have been marketed as environmentally friendly products. So they're choosing them unintentionally for these benefits, and also unintentionally for the benefits of health reasons as well. And so to a certain extent, people at this level are looking for information regarding their decisions on using these products. However, fragrance chemicals are not a major threat. People do not believe that this is a major threat either to themselves or to the environment. Yet a lot of folks are uncertain of whether or not there are regulatory measures in place to be able to deal with this particular topic. And so an interesting point as well is the demographics. Two key types of respondents in our demographics, and that is younger and people who have less formal education. And so one may hypothesize, well, why these particular groups of people? Well, social scientists have already known for a long time that fragrances are appealing to people's social and cultural desires. So this is some pictures, of famous ads showing body spray, kind of the equivalent as a pheromone to attract the opposite sex. So some of the recommendations that came out of our project is essentially there needs to be valid and accessible information that provides consumers with relevant information both to their health, the consequences of these products, and also to the environment. And then we think about information. Well, what types? Well, we have to consider that maybe just labeling fragrances isn't sufficient to really understand the cocktail of multiple ingredients that are added. Secondly, if we label these products such as limonene and additional ingredients, what does this actually mean to the consumer? Will we know what limonene actually does to the environment? And hopefully all of you know now after this presentation, but usually to any other individual, this might be something that they're unaware of. Additionally, what about organic and natural products? A lot of the respondents that were choosing these products for environmental friendly reasons, are they getting what they're paying for? We heard Jessica earlier discussing that some of these products contain chemicals that are just as bad as the commercial equivalent of them. Additionally, there needs to be some policy regulations in line, again, to address whether or not there's transparency in terms of labeling. But with that, keeping in mind maybe other economic tools that can incentivize the producers of these products to be more transparent. And with this in mind, bringing it back to this idea of fragrance chemicals being emerging environmental problems, will this be another surprise? Well, before in the ozone depletion debates, we didn't actually see the hole in the ozone layer until we actually had the technologies to be able to see it. And this picture here to the right is a yellow river in China, and it's one of the very more polluted rivers in that area. But we have polluted rivers here in the United States as well. But it's not until as human beings, when we actually see our rivers purple, that we become alarmed at the fact that there's a problem. And with things like fragrance chemical products and things that we can't necessarily see as humans, this might be something challenging for us to tackle now. And so with that in mind, this is an emerging issue of concern. The public is not fully aware or does not recognize a significant threat, and there's already scientific information showing that there are impacts both to the environment and to our own health. That existing, and also that there aren't policy regulations in line to be able to deal with this. So if this does become a surprise, who will then be held accountable? And with that in mind, it's not all doom and gloom yet. I think at the individual level, each one of us can take on responsibility and inform ourselves. So with that, based on some of our survey, since you have 10 to 14 opportunities to make different choices on your everyday basis, There are some consumer websites available online. For example, this is a good guide that you can type in the name of your product, and you will be provided with 3 different categories: health, environment, and society. It's kind of small here. But this website was actually initiated by a faculty member at UC Berkeley, so all of the information that is accessible to consumers has been put up there by scientists or folks who are highly researching this information. So this is an example of a common Head and Shoulders shampoo, getting a rating of 6 for health or 6.1 for the environment and society. And then you get top alternatives for the products that you want to use. This is another more common organic product. And what's great about this is that you can actually also see the trade-offs between other social aspects of these products. And then the Environmental Working Group also has a Skin Deep website where you can find over 69,000 products, and will give you similar information about the consequences to your own health, the environment, and just general information about the ingredients. So with that in mind, there's a lot of still research needs, policy tools, as I've mentioned, in order to curb some of our own behaviors are necessary and need to be looked into. Also, the ubiquity, persistence, fate, and long-term effects of some of these fragrant products. We're just getting the technology to be able to see some of these things in the environment. Better tools for monitoring them, and also the effects of information on pro and anti-environmental behavior. So what types of information actually makes us react to making decisions that will not be so detrimental to both our health or the environment. And finally, other human motives. An interesting point that Meredith brought up before in our results is that people are making decisions based on social constraints or norms. And what does that actually mean for the increased use of these products? And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge our iGrid advisors, our statisticians, Mark Grove, Jon Whelan, and of course all of the people who made this project possible, insights throughout the process, and also through their participation in different events we've hosted. And of course, the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, Megan Siegel, who we've been corresponding with, and Nicole for technical difficulties earlier, and of course the National Science Foundation for funding. Otherwise, we would not be here. Thank you, and we'll take questions.
So if you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And I'd also just like to say, I don't know if everybody saw, but we do have a handout that has all of those resources that we showed up here listed on them, so that you can take that home, and
There's websites.
it has all the websites. Yeah.
You mentioned someone from the EPA who was going to be looking at this issue, and could you give me that name or the website? I mean, I would encourage, I assume most people in this room are interested in a fragrance-free environment, and I would encourage everyone to contact someone who could maybe make a difference.
Yeah, his name is Matt Rodriguez. He's the new head of the EPA in California. So that's what he said specifically in a recorded interview, so you could actually look it up in NPR.
However, I would also encourage you to think about contacting the California Air Resources Board.
Yeah.
They actually regulate the volatile organic compound VOC content of personal care products manufactured in California or distributed in California. And so they currently have regulations in this state to deal with some of the potential secondary compounds released from these products. And they have a great website. If you just Google personal care products, California Air Resources Board, they have tons of information and email addresses of the staff members that you can email.
I was under the understanding that fragrance-free is different from unscented, that unscented is actually a scent.
So that was one fun thing we learned in our project.
Yeah.
Both can still have fragrance chemicals in them.
Even fragrance-free.
Fragrance-free, unscented is the one that we learned about. We learned that in unscented products, they actually can put chemicals in there to mask the fragrance chemicals they put in there. So even though they're unscented, they might actually be scented but have chemicals that mask some other scent.
Or
So
like fragrant. Oh yeah.
but to be totally honest, I'm not sure how that term is regulated. And what I would encourage you to do is there is a particular website on our list called Greener Choices Database. It's run by the Consumers Union, nonprofit organization, and they specifically examine labels and how transparent and effective certain labels are and whether they even mean anything. So you could go on our website, look up fragrance-free label, and you might get a little more information about what that actually means and whether it's legitimate or not. My understanding is it's not really regulated.
What was the question?
Yeah, the terms natural and organic really have meaning in this particular area, or is it as bad as in the food industry where natural is ill-defined, I mean, undefined? Organic has some meanings in the state of California, different meanings in federal. It's like, what is it like in the fragrance industry?
That was also something that we saw, that there weren't really any regulations about these labels.
Well, so there are starting to be regulations, USDA organic regulations for personal care products. You should look for the 100% USDA organic label. But there's a whole natural industry, same as in the food that
you wouldn't have any idea really what natural means.
But I was just going to say, the other thing is that also some of these fragrance chemicals, even if they are natural and derived from, say, like plant sources, they can still be quite toxic in certain concentrations. And, so it doesn't necessarily, just because it's from a plant, plants make all these chemicals to defend themselves. So, they're not, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe in all cases.
Because limonene is a natural plant extract, but
We all like our pine trees, but the terpenes they give off are for exactly the purpose that we were talking about.
And there also might be chemical sensitivities, like if you, in some chemicals, you might need maybe 100 chemicals to make a particular scent when it's natural, but you might only need one chemical, like artificially, to make one scent. So if a person is allergic, which scent in that 100 scents or compounds are they allergic to versus one compound in an artificial scent? So those are some questions that.
I know one of the concerns with personal care products is endocrine disruptors in waterways. Is there a direct link between fragrances and endocrine disruptors?
Yeah, so some of the musk compounds have been shown to have estrogenic activity, and I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done there, and it's not clear what the ultimate impacts will be, but we do know that it does have these endocrine disrupting potential.
Was it also at doses much higher? Do you remember?
I think they were higher doses than usually is found. I mean, most of the testing that's done, they take water samples or something and they show what concentration the chemical is in those samples. But there's a lot of potential for bioaccumulation, or where chemicals will get concentrated, and as they move up the food chain, there's more and more chemicals in larger animals. So it's possible that they might reach concentrations where they do see these effects.
Talking about a fragrance-free environment, aren't there some things that are made that have the natural fragrance as part of the product? So to have a fragrance-free environment, I mean, flowers that bloom have a fragrance, and so if you have some of these products that already have the fragrance embedded in them, you're not going to end up with a fragrance-free environment.
I think with regards to what's been done in terms of some workplaces going fragrance-free, for example, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, is a fragrance-free workplace. They have basically limited it to synthetic and things that go on the human body. So obviously, if there's flowers around and cleaning products also maybe, I think they've tried to switch to other types of cleaning products, but I think the idea is that as an individual, as a person, that you would try to limit your personal use of fragrance products because of the potential allergies that other people around you might have. But certainly, you go outside and there's pine trees and there's flowers and things like that, so we'll never have a completely fragrance-free environment, but from my understanding of some of the initiatives that have moved forward in terms of fragrance-free workplaces, it's been limiting the personal use of those products.
I've heard of places, though, that would have, they'd haul out, somebody would bring in Easter lilies, and those are just so overpowered.
Oh, yeah.
They'd have to haul
Right.
down.
Right.
And a lot of these fragrances also have concentrations of even some of the natural chemicals that are higher than we might see in the environment, or might be emitted from, say, a tree or a flower or something. It's more concentrated.
So it's more about people knowing what is in the chemicals that are used, and having that knowledge so that they know what to avoid. Because if you just have a label that says fragrance, you don't know what's in it, so you don't know if any of those chemicals are affecting you. But if you have something that's, coconut, and you're not allergic to coconut, it shouldn't affect you, but you have to be aware that it could affect somebody else.
Mm-hmm. And even if they label coconut fragrance, as we emphasize, it could say coconut fragrance or citrus, but they can also be synthetic chemicals that are making up.
So it's the
Right.
the composition of the fragrance that you need to be aware of, so you can avoid what you are allergic to.
And that's why some of these resources that we give are really great, because you can really dig into individual products, and it will tell you if it got a bad health score, well, which actual chemical is it? What part of it is giving it that bad score? So then you can look for that and try to avoid it. And it also, I think, like Carmen said, suggests alternative products, which was one of my favorite parts about it. I was like, oh, well, I didn't know that my Tom's deodorant was so terrible. What else can I use? So there's the information is empowering. Sure. Yeah.
There was one here and then back there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you had found anything that was a good website for how to inform other people in your building, or if you don't have a regulation that says we're going to make this building fragrance free, we put up a sign for a long time that said, this is a fragrance free workplace on the door. It didn't matter. So if there's like a way to get
you don't always know. I mean, you can be wearing a scent or fragrance, you can have lotion on, whatever, and you walk into an office and you don't know that the people there may be hypersensitive.
Right, yeah. So I actually was just realizing that I got this sweater at the mall and didn't wash it. And as I'm sitting here sniffing it, I'm like, you know what? It's got all the perfumes that were in the mall, but I didn't even sniff it because, you get it for Christmas and you put it on.
Yeah,
It's a sweater. But
University of Oregon has a good, it's not a fragrance-free, I mean, it's kind of a voluntary policy. They really had a good policy statement, and even suggested what a manager or supervisor could do if someone were not to be following, so I would suggest that.
University of Oregon?
Mm-hmm.
I think
CSU Stanislaus also has a fragrance-free policy for the entire campus. So you could look towards them for some resources, most likely.
Yeah. What can we do about Axe body spray? Can we do this?
I didn't come here very early, so I don't know some of the conversation that was going on, but I've heard over and over, allergy. Many of us don't have allergies. I mean, allergies are easier to deal with, and I'm not saying that they can't be dangerous, with having asthma or something like that. But when you have a chemical sensitivity, there's really nothing you can do except avoid it. And I'm thankful to be in this room with all these people and be comfortable for a change, I'm going to say.
And you had a question?
Actually, I came tonight with the intention of listening to your presentation, when you went into the subject of labeling. And Heather and I had a conversation. She gave me permission to make a little announcement. So I wonder if you're not aware, there is a ballot initiative that's coming forward to label genetically engineered foods. We're in the first thrust of organizing people around the state to help with their signature gathering. It will require that any food sold in a grocery store must be labeled, contains GMO. And the good thing is, it won't apply to restaurants or alcoholic beverages, but it will also require that anything labeled natural if it contains a genetically modified organism, they can no longer use the term natural. So if anybody is interested in getting involved in that, and the surveys show the same statistics that you showed, about 80% of the population want full disclosure. So if anyone would be interested in getting involved, just come over and see me after the meeting.
So if your group were in charge of, if you could change regulations, what would you do? You know, what would be the things that you personally talk about? Like, if we were in charge, we would do this as president.
How much money do you have?
Let's say you're...
Are we like Department of Defense budget here? Well, I think one thing that, as a policy person, I'll foster this one first, but I think one of the biggest issues is, well, there's a couple. I mean, obviously there's an ingredient disclosure, there's a disclosure thing, but I think Carmen did a really nice job of talking about, well, I don't know that if I want every single chemical in my product on my label, because will I ever even know what that means? So I think that ingredient disclosure only goes so far. I think what we really lack in the FDA, and I'll talk about household cleaners in a moment actually, but what we really lack is government testing and oversight of these products. They rely on the industry to test all their own products, and they rely on the industry to submit information about those products. It's actually very similar to genetic engineering. And so I certainly think there's lots of great companies out there, but I think that you get into a problem where you don't have third-party verification or independent research that's going on, when the company themselves obviously stands to benefit quite heavily if they can just use these products. So I think one of the biggest issues would be actually allocating money to the FDA, who regulates personal care products, to do actual testing, to actually see what these chemicals do. And I think further, if we know, like Jess said, that we have 900 toxic chemicals that are allowed to be used in these laboratories that create fragrances, or we know that certain things have toxicity levels, there needs to be better just banning of chemicals. I mean, if we know things are very clearly, with strong scientific grounding, causing human or environmental health impacts, we need to actually get the government to ban some of these products or these individual compounds.
We had also talked about fragrances as a trade secret. I don't think that was actually mentioned in the presentation, but a lot of these things aren't listed because these companies say they are trade secrets. We don't really want other companies to know, where in truth, other companies can easily shoot whatever fragrance it is into like one of those chemistry machines and figure out the compound. So in a way, there's no reason why it should be hidden, and in that way, there's more disclosure both to the public and also government agencies can figure it out.
I was going to say also in the EU they have different labeling systems for natural and organic products, where they have some label that has something. I mean, there's multiple ones, and that's a little bit of a problem because people don't know what they actually mean, but that have certain criteria that product has to meet to get that label. And I think it could be beneficial to have something like that here if it's well publicized and it's like regulated by one entity and there's one label or something. It gets confusing if there's too many different ones, but I think that there could be simpler labeling that would give people the ability to make more informed decisions without necessarily having every single ingredient listed.
And if I could just highlight one other thing with what Susan said, this trade secrets aspect. It's actually really interesting. I'm surprised we haven't brought it up yet. But one of the other things besides reverse engineering, so these companies can just take a product, reverse engineer it, and figure out everything that's in it. A researcher that we worked with told us that if they really cared about their trade secrets, they would get a patent, and they would just patent the actual scent. And none of them have done that, because when you apply for a patent, you actually have to disclose everything that's in your product. And so no one has patents on fragrances because then they actually have to disclose everything. And so it's this weird sort of murky area where, oh, we can't label things, we have to have this fragrance term because of trade secrets, but in reality, everyone knows what's in everyone else's products anyway.
Well, you're talking about the European Union. Are consumers in the European Union higher have a higher level of awareness, more understanding, more, do they care more? Well, I mean, you've got the perfume industry in France. I mean, it's, are those labeled natural or not? Or
So they're still not required to list all the ingredients in the EU for the fragrances. And the sort of more broad scheme labeling system that I was talking about was for not just for fragrance chemicals, but that was just for like environmental green products, just and they had
There's only 26 they have to list, which are the most common human health allergies.
but they have banned. So there are some musk fragrances that there are some of the ones that have these endocrine disrupting properties and all these other things. There's one in particular that's been banned from being used at all in the EU, and so they have some more stringent policies.
I think it comes back to the precautionary principle concept, which is something that the EU really embraces, which is trying to be a little more proactive about what could happen and really thinking a little more broadly about the risks and taking action before we actually know that something has happened, which is not necessarily a policy that we've embraced very well in the United States.
I'd just like to address that for a moment, because this came up in our GMO conversations, is that many of the reports and studies done by our own government cannot be published in this country because of backlash from the companies who produce the products. So they all get sent to Europe. And so they breed them there, and that's why they are so stringent on organic, natural things there. So they're better informed is one of your answers.
But are they healthier? Or do they just make up for it in a different area?
In terms of your comments about patents, I work in the industry with patents, some things, in some areas you need trade secret. But one of the big issues of patents is enforcement. And sometimes you purposely did not patent because we knew that the cost of enforcement was so great, especially with other countries doing things that we just chose not to. That's the reason why we did not.
That's a really good point. I don't know anything about patents, so go ahead and write it up.
I was thinking about your survey, and I'm wondering if it got at all with the comparison of people who buy organic and natural products to conventional products, at what people's perception of what fragrance means in an organic and natural product compared to a conventional product.
We didn't specifically ask that question, but there.
No, I'm just
What's interesting about that particular question is there is kind of a global oversight in the fragrance industry, and I'm blanking out on the name. But they had this really interesting survey on their website, and one of the questions that they would ask randomly to people was, do you know what a scent contains? And often the response to people was, well, lemon in this kind of, yellow bottle. And so, but we didn't specifically ask those questions.
One thing we did ask was what people thought the word fragrance meant.
Yeah.
Okay.
We didn't ask specifically about what they thought an organic fragrance meant, but we showed them a picture of the label that we showed you that said fragrance, and we said, what do you think this means? And we gave them a bunch of options, and one was that it's one ingredient, one was that it's tens of ingredients, and then one was that it's hundreds of ingredients. And actually, most people, the majority of people did know that it was more than one ingredient. But we did have like a strong minority who thought fragrance was one thing. Mm-hmm. So there's still misinformation about that.
But what it actually is.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be different if you said how many compounds are in as organic compared to conventional. Is what people's perception is.
I'm really curious because I do use organic products. Which ones did you find were the safest, or maybe was there a brand that was more trustworthy?
We didn't do anything about branding, about testing what products. If you want that kind of information, you should probably check the websites to look for it.
I've just done a little bit of looking around on that good guide, and it seems like it's not necessarily broken down by company either. Like some products from a particular company are much safer than others. I think there is some correlation between okay, this is a really good company and they generally have safer products, but there's some that it's pretty product specific.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned you were going to get into household cleaners.
Ah, yes. Household cleaners, even less regulated than personal care products. The policy for household cleaners is that they do not require them to be labeled with ingredients at all. And what is even more confusing, I think, is that you are allowed to label some things, whatever you want, but not everything. So if you, and I should also, well, I'll mention that in a moment, but so let's say that you have 2 ingredients you really want to highlight, like you use some natural lemon scent. You can say ingredients, natural lemon scent, comma, other ingredients. So it's, I think, even more misleading because then you think that you're getting like all the information, but you're really only getting one piece of it. But they're not required to list ingredients at all. But we should also mention that we had a conference in the fall at UC Davis where we invited people from the government, from Environmental Working Group, which is a nonprofit organization, and from the industry to come and participate with us and have a really good dialogue and to discuss these issues. And no one from the industry came. We asked them to come. We worked with them for up to a month to get them to come. And this was the trade association for the fragrance industry. But we did have a positive interaction with the Clorox company, and they were planning on sending someone, but they were not able to make that date. But we did have a good relationship with an individual company, but the trade group for the fragrance industry refused to come.
And actually, Clorox, just to go off of that, has been one of the few companies to take the step forward to trying to make their ingredients more transparent to the public.
But they still don't list fragrance.
Right.
Like what are in that, the compounds in it.
Yes. And the Sierra Club endorsement of their green products was very controversial.
Well, let's give them a round of applause for their And thanks everyone for coming, and please join us at our next lecture on February 23rd about transportation sustainability and the 2 billion cars drive towards sustainability. And you're welcome to come up and talk to the presenters for your outreach sheets. Everyone, how are you doing this evening? Good. Thank you for coming. It's actually very interesting that we have a small group, but we are recording tonight's lecture because I received so many phone calls from people who said, thank you for covering this topic, that we're really interested in this topic, but we can't come because we have chemical sensitivities. I mean, I probably had 8 or 9, 10 in that range of people who were really interested, and one woman sent me some brochures that she wanted me to place up there, so those are from someone named Susie, and there were a shocking number of people who were really excited about this topic and saying that they couldn't come to hear about the topic because of their aversion to fragrance chemicals. So we have invited up a group of researchers and graduate students from the University of California at Davis. We have our monthly lecture each month, and the next lecture that's coming up is February 23rd on transportation sustainability. It is with Dan Sperling and Tom Turrentine with the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, and they are going to be talking about a lecture on 2 billion cars driving towards sustainability. And there's actually a book on the topic, and it should be another excellent topic to present. And what else do I want to share? We have a Project WET workshop coming up on February 9th. It's going to be here, and February 16th will be in South Shore, and that's water education for teachers. So if anyone's interested in learning about presenting water topics to kids all the way pre-K through college, it's a really fun hands-on workshop. And then on March 22nd, we're having a climate change lecture with Dr. Howie Spiro, who's an internationally known climate scientist who's going to be talking about our changing oceans and how they're using ocean algae to learn about climate change. So I am going to stop my introductions and welcome up our group from UC Davis, and they can introduce themselves. They'll do a better job than I will. So please give them a round of applause and welcome.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hello.
How are you all doing tonight? So before we begin, I want to just take a brief moment to talk about our group. And I know there's a lot of acronyms like IGERT and REACH, and that's a little bit distinct. So IGERT essentially is a nationally known program
being added to products. So we see this change in human activity. And so the next part of this is that this feeds back to affect people and the environment. And so we know that there are some demonstrated health impacts of fragrances and also evidence of potential negative impacts to the environment. So the fragrance industry uses nearly 3,000 ingredients in its products. Most of these are synthetic compounds. They're not natural compounds. And 900 have been identified as being toxic. And a single fragrance in any of these products is not just one ingredient. It can sometimes be hundreds of different chemicals. And studies have found that these chemicals are often emitted into the air and become vapors that we can breathe in. And some of these of which are toxic and or carcinogenic. And one study found that green, organic, or natural products contain about the same number of toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, fragrance chemicals, as do conventional products. So it's not necessarily true that organic or natural will be healthier in terms of the fragrance. And we also know that many people, as was discussed earlier, have allergies to fragrance. And this can cause things like headaches and dizziness and nausea and all these different side effects. And the survey showed that about 30% of the general public have experienced some sort of irritation due to fragrance chemicals. And this percentage can be much higher in people that have asthma or chemical sensitivities. And one of the most common allergic reactions are skin irritation or rashes, with 20% of the general public experiencing this form of irritation. So we see that these products are affecting people and their health. We also have some evidence that they have potential harm to the environment. There's been studies of these two very common fragrance chemicals, limonene and musks, that are in all sorts of fragrances. And they're the ones where the most work has been done to study their toxicity. And they found that these can have harmful effects to many animals, including insects, fish, cats, rats. And limonene is also known to be used as an herbicide, so it kills and slows the growth of many plants. There's also been studies that find increased risk of breast cancer due to musk chemicals, and that musks can also cause liver damage in rats. Now, I will note that in many of these cases, they're using concentrations of chemicals that are much higher than the ones that typically found in the environment. But these chemicals also can attach to people and be ingested and sometimes rise to higher concentrations. Our cleaning products, all sorts of things. And it's a huge industry. The flavor and fragrance industry sales from 2010 were about $22 billion. And this is nearly double the sales in 2000, which were about $13 billion. So you can see there's a dramatic increase in the use of these fragrance and flavor chemicals. And if you look at the market for fragrances in 2006, you can see that the majority of the market is for cosmetics, toiletries, soaps, detergents, and household cleaners. And really, only a fairly small fraction, only about 20%, goes into these fine fragrances or perfumes and colognes. And so so there's a clear increase in the use of fragrances. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's plenty of public media that pick up on this too.
Folks, I spend a lot of my time in the morning grooming. I try to be quick about it, but the guy in the mirror keeps coming on. That's why I'm giving a tip of my hat to the new disposable razor for men, the Schick Extreme 3 Fit Style Refresh. This ain't your daddy's Schick Extreme 3 Fit Style. This one has added the word refresh. Because unlike every men's razor that has ever come before it, this one has a scented handle that blends notes of spearmint, citrus, and rosemary and evokes having just showered. Remind me, you can smell something that smells like it just showered right after you've just showered. And I'd say it's about damn time. I cannot tell you how many mornings I stood in my bathroom smelling my soap, a shampoo, conditioner, body wash, body spray, facial lotion, shaving cream, aftershave, and hand lotion, and said, something's missing. And the people over at Schick agree with me, telling the New York Times the razor is probably the only thing left in the shower that's not scented. Bravo, gentlemen. Now I can throw away my previous solution, shaving with a box cutter duct taped to a Glade plug-in. Right up there. Next up.
So you can see that there is this change in human behavior. As more and more fragrances are
funded by the National Science Foundation, and they're across the nation, and basically they're programs to get graduate students trained to creating these projects that are multidisciplinary. And so IGER stands for Integrative Graduate Research, Education, and Traineeship. And the IGER at UC Davis that we're a part of is called REACH, and that stands for Responding to Rapid Environmental Change. And just as the name implies, it essentially focuses on understanding the responses to rapid environmental change. And today you'll have a unique opportunity to get an example of what types of projects come out of this particular IGERT. So before we begin, I want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Carmen Cortez. I'm in the graduate group in ecology. My focus is in human ecology. Jennifer Balatowski could not join us. She's also one of our team members. She's a plant scientist. And our advisors, Rick Grossberg and Carol Hum. They're both in the Department of Evolution and Ecology. And I'll let the rest of my colleagues present themselves.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Meredith Niles. I'm also in the graduate group in ecology at UC Davis. I'm in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. So I'm sort of the resident policy person on this team, and I study agriculture and climate change policy.
My name is Susan Chen, and I'm in the Agricultural Resource Economics program at UC Davis, and just focusing on resource and natural resource economics.
I'm Jessica Abbott. I'm in the population biology graduate group. My focus is on marine ecology, and I'm in the Department of Evolution and Ecology. Okay, so before we jump into our research and what we did, I want to just walk you through what we're talking about today. And as you'll see, we focused on sort of the human component of fragrance, chemicals, and personal care products, and how people make decisions about when to use them and how to use them. But we also wanted to frame this in a broader context as an emerging environmental issue. And so first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what an emerging environmental issue is and how fragrance chemicals fit into that. And then we'll move into our own research and look more at this human behavior component, talk about the research that we did, which was a national survey, go into the results, and then we'll conclude bringing everything together and talking about some resources for you to use to be able to make informed decisions about using personal care products. So what is an emerging issue? Well, the United Nations describes an emerging issue as an issue, positive or negative, which is not yet generally recognized, but which may have significant impact on human and or ecosystem health in the 21st century. And so an interesting part of this is the not yet generally recognized. So if these are really important issues and they could potentially have these high impacts, how are they not known about in the public? Well, some of these are surprises. Some emerging issues like the ozone hole were things that people didn't predict that were going to happen. Other things are accidents like oil spills where no one really knows that it's going to happen, and even though you try to prevent it, it becomes an issue that needs to be dealt with. Yet many emerging issues are existing issues that we know something about, like climate change, desertification, or plastics in the oceans. Yet these are things that we may not know exactly what the consequences are yet, or have really good solutions for how to fix them. And so we know that there are these existing emerging issues, but so what's the kind of definition of an emerging issue? Well, here are 3 characteristics that we think are pretty common across emerging issues. The first is that there are changes in human activity that feed back to affect people and the environment. The second is that there's new evidence or theory that suggests that there are these dramatic environmental changes, but maybe there's not, maybe most people don't know about it yet, or there's not necessarily consensus about what's causing it or how to deal with it. And a third characteristic that's common across emerging issues is there's usually a lack of adequate policy instruments for addressing this worsening issue. And so there are some challenges that surround addressing emerging issues. Often they're controversial. There can be disagreement among scientists, policymakers, or both about what the actual impacts of these issues are going to be and how to effectively deal with them. There's also a lot of uncertainty. So it requires decision-making without necessarily knowing what the future holds. And as such, it's kind of risky because you have to make sacrifices today to potentially prevent future harm. And so that's sort of an overview of what general emerging issues are, and now I'm going to walk you through why I think, or why we think, that fragrance chemicals and personal care products are a good example of an emerging issue. So going back to that first point, that there are changes in human activity that feed back to affect people in the environment. So the change here really is the increase in use of fragrances. So it used to be more that fragrances were for special occasions, or they're mostly in perfumes or colognes, but now they're in so many of our products. They're in our soaps and shampoos,